Hi, my name is Beth Barabalt, and today I'm going to talk about cognitive modeling of performance on the observer bet task and the implications of this work for reinforcement learning theory. But before I get into the core of the talk, I'd like to start by talking a bit about learning. When we learn about the world, we're often learning through experience. We make a sequence of repeated choices and learn from the outcome of each choice. So how we select an action to take at each point in time is going to be dependent on the collective results of our previous actions. Our action selection may also depend on our learning strategy. One such strategy is to transition over time from explore actions to exploit actions. When we explore, we try a variety of actions to see what the outcome for each may be. This will prioritize the gain of information, but at the cost of reward. Once we reach some threshold of certainty as to which actions are beneficial to select, we can switch to exploit actions. Now we consistently select what we believe is the best action in hopes of maximizing reward. How do people manage the explore-exploit trade-off? The answer to this is going to depend in part on the individual and in part on the environment. If which action is best can change with time, then one should periodically go back to exploring. So the main question I'll try to answer in this talk is, how do people manage the explore-exploit trade-off when the environment is dynamic and when feedback is intermittent? Now, typically when we think about explore-exploit trade-off, it's in the context of reinforcement learning, but in a typical lab RL task, exploration and exploitation are fundamentally conflated. This is because for any given action, it's impossible to be sure of the motivation behind it. So let's consider the binary prediction task, which is kind of like a two-arm bandit task. You'll see a box with two lights. This box is biased to turn one of the lights on more often, and your job is to predict which light will turn on next. What if we tweak this task so as to separate learning about outcomes from the accrual of rewards? The observer bet task does exactly this. It adds a third response option, observe, and in doing so, it presents an opportunity to disentangle exploration and exploitation by making the motivation behind a given action unambiguous. So if you choose to observe, you can see which light turns on, but you forgo any gain or loss of points. If you choose to bet, you're blind to what the box does, but you gain a point if you were correct and lose a point if you were incorrect. And in this way, observe actions are made to be purely information seeking, and so are clear explore actions, while betting actions are purely reward seeking, and so are clear exploit actions. And in our experiment, participants completed 5 blocks of the dynamic version of the task, in which the true light sequence for each box has a switch point. Which color is more frequent switches partway through the block. On each of the 50 trials, the participant chooses whether to observe, the circles, or bet, the X's. And at the end of the block, and only at the end of the block, participants are able to see the history of rewards that they earned. So recent work with this task has assumed that the process driving human behavior is similar to that of an optimal agent, and that reinforcement learning can't capture behavior on this task. But if we didn't make these assumptions, could we perhaps better describe human behavior on the observer bet task? And can computational modeling help us to better understand the explore-exploit trade-off? So I'm going to start with the optimal agent. Navarro, Newell, and Schulz, they worked out the optimal solution to this task by defining the optimal agent as Bayesian reasoner. It turns out that the full optimal policy is similar to a simpler policy, which is a Markov decision process where the state is the number of A events observed minus the number of B events observed. And this difference in counts, combined with the trial number, gives the optimal probability of observing. From the optimal policy, they derive the optimal threshold, which we can use to simulate the behavior of an optimal agent. If the evidence is between the thresholds, the agent observes. If the evidence trips one of the thresholds, the agent bets. In a dynamic environment, this accumulated evidence is decayed over time to allow the agent to adapt and occasionally observe again. The optimal agent alternates between observing and betting, as do our participants, but it's important to note that the optimal agent's behavior will differ from human behavior in some systematic ways. For example, the agent always begins by observing, and its betting streaks are always rational and consistent. Nonetheless, this was an excellent starting point for model development, and it helped Navarro and colleagues to develop a model of human behavior. This is because the agent gave a sense of how the underlying process might work, and it suggested meaningful behavioral patterns that a model should be able to capture. So in our data, we see that participants largely approach the task in the right way. They observe more at the start of a block than at the end, and bet on the popular light color about as often as it turns on in the true light sequence. Ideally, we develop a model that can not only capture the rate of all actions across trials and across observation history states, but also one that can offer an explanation of how and why individual participants adopt different explore-exploit trade-off strategies. We can see here a wide variety of behavior across participants. Some participants bet once and then go straight back to observing, while other participants make these long streaks of bets. And some participants exhibit suboptimal behaviors. Like these two participants here make sequences of bets that aren't all in the same color. These inconsistent or mixed betting streaks are a failure to exploit properly. Across all participants, we see this in about 20% of betting streaks. Other suboptimal behaviors that the cognitive model should capture include not always observing on the first trial, and not always betting on the last trial, and not always betting on the last light color they observed, which the optimal agent will do 100% of the time, but people don't. So Navarro and colleagues' heuristic model was inspired by the optimal agent, but is a cognitive process model. It posits that you keep a running tally of the number of orange versus blue lights that you observed. You decay the evidence to cope with the dynamic environment. Bet if you exceed one of the thresholds, while allowing this comparison to be noisy, because humans are noisy. And the threshold decreases over time, hopefully in a way that mimics the optimal policy. So here's the full hierarchical Bayesian model specification, which you can peruse later if you like. Navarro and colleagues found that the model with piecewise linearly declining thresholds and with evidence decay was best able to account for their data. However, in our stand implementation versus the original JAGs, we found that piecewise thresholds required a parameter that was unrecoverable and pathological. So I included a new model version with linearly declining thresholds to capture the same idea. I also extended the model on the evidence decay side by allowing evidence decay to increase over time. However, I wondered if established cognitive processes might already be able to explain this behavior. What about a model built from a Q-learning framework? Perhaps people are instead using an existing cognitive process and simply adapting it to suit the peculiarities of the task at hand. If this was successful, it could represent a meaningful extension of reinforcement learning models and theory. One reason this would be meaningful is that, as Blanchard and Gershman explicitly emphasize, under a strict interpretation of reinforcement learning, RL models should not be able to capture observer bet task performance. But by relaxing a few strictures, I successfully adapted RL for the observer bet task by developing a new modified RL model, which I will build up for you now. In the simplest model I considered, before the first trial, we assign all actions, bet on orange, bet on blue, observe, a naive value of 0. On each trial, we either initialize or forget the values from the last trial, convert the Q values into action probabilities with inverse temperature beta, and use those probabilities to roll a die on an action. And then, here's the modified bit, rather than learning from receiving rewards, which the participant doesn't see until the end of the block, they now learn from observations. One way to interpret this is that when a participant observes, they think, I just saw an orange light, so if I had bet on orange, I would have earned a point. Alternatively, we can interpret this as the outcome being reinforcing in and of itself, which is the interpretation I prefer. But the model, as specified here, has a problem, namely that participants would rarely observe again after the first trial because the observe actions value is never updated. So we make a second modification to overcome this obstacle. I consider that participants might be coming into each block with a high value already assigned to the observe action. This is captured by the QOBS parameter. Now, when the participant bets, the value of each betting action will decay towards 0, while the value of observation stays put. This allows bets values to fall back below the value of observation again. I also considered a model where this boosted observation value decreases over time, and models with counterfactual learning, in case participants also learn from the outcome that failed to occur. The idea is that if the participant sees an orange light, they not only think, if I had bet on orange, I would have earned a point, but they also think, if I had bet on blue, I would have lost a point. Since this is a hierarchical Bayesian model, I also specify priors and hyperpriors. And I ultimately compared 6 heuristic models and 6 modified RL models, where the modified RL models include all possible combinations of the extensions I just described. And here are our model comparison results. Our winning model is the modified RL model with both direct and counterfactual learning, and with a decreasing, non-updating, value assigned to the observe action. The posterior predictives for this model were also the best out of the set. The model mimics the action rates across trials and observation history states, as well as participants' rates of suboptimal behavior. And with the winning model in hand, we can dive into the modified RL model's parameter estimates. We see the direct learning rates were consistently higher than the counterfactual learning rates, both at the group and individual level. And it's interesting to see the substantial counterfactual learning rates here. Counterfactual learning seems to be very important for learning from intermittent feedback in the observer bet task. We can also see that individual differences in inverse temperature seem to predict suboptimal behaviors, specifically participants' rate of betting on the last outcome observed, which would be a rate of 1 for the optimal agent. This strongly correlates with inverse temperature, but not with other parameters, such as the forgetting rate, phi. If we interpret inverse temperature as sensitivity to value during action selection, then it makes sense that this exploit action-specific noise is more common when beta is lower. Finally, let's look at how participants' naive value of the observe action QOBS changes across trials. We see that at the start of a block, nearly all participants assign a higher value to the observe action than to the bet actions. So most participants start with a strong tendency to explore. We can also see that QOBS declines over time for almost everyone, meaning most participants used a high-level strategy to transition from explore to exploit actions over time. And from the modified RL model, we can now explain how people manage the explore-exploit trade-off. And I'll use some figures like this with model-derived action probabilities for one participant, one block to demonstrate. In an uncertain environment, we value exploration highly, as you can see here on the first trial and around the change point. We switch from explore to exploit actions as the expected value of a reward-seeking action exceeds the value of information gathering and vice versa. As you can see for the second participant, the model estimated policy matches the switches in behavior. However, if we're insensitive to these value signals, then we begin acting haphazardly, as you see the uncertain policy enabling the mixed betting here. So one final point about the implications of this work for reinforcement learning theory. Our model-based results suggest that a broader interpretation of reinforcement learning is warranted. Under a very strict interpretation, RL should only capture learning from rewards, meaning extrinsically rewarding feedback. But in the observer bet task, participants never directly learn from rewards. No reward feedback is seen until the block's already over. So that the modified RL model works despite this suggests that simply experiencing outcomes may be perceived as intrinsically rewarding, and/or that reward processing mechanisms might also be recruited for learning from outcomes. And if we recall that reward processing is a canonical neural computation, then perhaps we should view RL as a canonical cognitive process. And through this lens, we can view our results as a case example of how, when presented with a new cognitive task, rather than develop a new strategy, we tend to first try to adapt our general purpose cognitive machinery to suit our current goals, the environmental context. So finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators, especially Menon. This data comes from clinical research that she led, and the modeling I contributed is just a component of that larger work. All right, Thanks for listening.